Hi, I'm Filippo Olivieri. Welcome back to Cracking the Cube, my series of lectures about Stanley Kubrick and his films. This episode is a bit different because it pushes Kubrick aside and focuses on one of his collaborators, the writer Anthony Burgess, and how his life was turned upside down when his novel A Clockwork Orange was brought to fame by the film adaptation that Kubrick made. Brace yourself, it's quite the ride. This is the story of two artists, film director Stanley Kubrick and novelist Anthony Burgess, and of the dramatic changes brought to their lives and careers by a controversial work, A Clockwork Orange. I will follow Burgess's perspective of the events and focus on his reactions to the clockwork phenomenon. The novel A Clockwork Orange was published in 1962 without any particular success. It sold poorly and was met with mixed reviews in England, though it was received better in the United States. In 1970, Kubrick acquired the film rights, and Burgess reacted to the news with a mixture of indifference — other filmmakers had already tried an adaptation and failed — mild satisfaction — better Kubrick than Ken Russell, whom Burgess detested — and mild dissatisfaction, because he knew he wouldn't get any money from the deal. A few months later, Burgess was in Australia on a lecture tour when he was urgently summoned by Kubrick, who had begun writing the screenplay. Burgess rushed from New Zealand to Fiji, Hawaii, San Francisco, New York and London, where he dutifully appeared at Kubrick's restaurant of choice. Kubrick, however, did not turn up. Burgess, an opposite to Kubrick in his relationship with the media, vented his anger to a newspaper and said Kubrick was a terrible man, just shocking. Whatever the reason for the failed rendezvous, when the two finally met for a preview screening of the film, Kubrick was cordial and invited Burgess at his home for dinner. They discussed literature and music and the possibility of collaborating on a new project, a film about Napoleon Bonaparte. The film of A Clockwork Orange was set to open in December 1971. Since Kubrick had no desire to travel, Warner Brothers asked Burgess to join Malcolm McDowell for a promotional round of interviews across the United States. Burgess, who enjoyed attention and exposure very much, gladly accepted. Meeting hordes of reporters, Burgess spoke highly of Kubrick's work. "I am very pleased with the way Kubrick handled my book," he said. "I have nothing but praise for the way he's found cinematic equivalents for my literary conceptions." Burgess called the film the most faithful adaptation of a book I've ever seen and considered Kubrick a truly European director, more in the mold of Antonioni or Truffaut than any of his fellow Americans. Burgess confessed he had fears about anyone filming the novel, but he needn't have worried. Kubrick hit the whole theological tone exactly. Journalists immediately jumped on the implication and asked Burgess about the violence in the film. "The point of the film is not the violence," Burgess retorted. "The violence is secondary. The point is that man must have the power to choose, or he ceases to be a man." The promotional activities kept Burgess busy for 2 months, and he had a great time in the spotlight, delighting audiences as the consummate raconteur that he was. The climate waiting for him in England was quite different. In The Sun, a film critic perfectly expressed the tabloid's titillation. A Clockwork Orange has more bare breasts and more pubic hair than any reputable film I have seen. The social context played a huge role in how the film of A Clockwork Orange was received in Britain. The United Kingdom was in a period of extreme social tensions, with the IRA bombing campaign on the mainland Britain and the miners' strikes causing severe power cuts. There were concerns over violent youth subcultures, and alleged crime waves were being reported in the media. Visual culture was under attack too. In 1971, Ken Russell's The Devils and Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs shocked audiences and challenged the British Board of Film Censors with their depiction of sex, violence and blasphemy. A Labour MP, Maurice Edelman, wrote an incendiary editorial to alert people to the dangers of screening Kubrick's film. The glamorization of violence on the screen, he maintained, will encourage the sadistic impulses of teenagers. They will, no doubt, dress like the druggies and therefore act like them. Burgess called this line of reasoning rubbish and nonsense and questioned Edelman's air of fatalism, which equated man to a naked ape who can't help but copy what it sees. If it were so, Burgess observed, it would be impossible to show Hamlet for fear the youthful watchers would kill their own uncles. The public debate was so heated that even Kubrick, who usually never replied to anything written about his films, felt the need to speak up. And he did so in the most Kubrickian way, a numbered list explaining the real causes of violence. Burgess expressed a more elaborate view in a lengthy piece for the Los Angeles Times. What hurts me, and also Kubrick, is the allegation made by some viewers and readers of A Clockwork Orange that there is a gratuitous indulgence in violence which turns an intended homiletic work into a pornographic one. If Orange, like 1984, takes its place as one of the salutary literary warnings or cinematic warnings against flabbiness, sloppy thinking, and overmuch trust in the state, then it will have done something of value. Note how, every time Burgess spoke or wrote, the book and the film perfectly coincided in his view, almost as if A Clockwork Orange was an entity that manifested itself with a literary version and a cinematic one. The book and the film appeared as two close artistic siblings, stemmed from similar concerns and sharing the same aspirations. Even more than that, Burgess seemed to feel that he and Kubrick were twin artists. It is therefore very surprising to read that just 3 months later, Burgess had completely changed his mind. At the Cannes Film Festival, where he was again sent for promotional duties, he said with stunning candor, as a reporter put it, that the film was a reversal of his intention. By making Alex so charming and his victims so stupid, Kubrick had made the violence seem justified. For the first time, Burgess took some distance. The film is an interpretation of the book, whereas Truffaut or Fellini produced pure film, Kubrick is only interpreting. Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, Burgess quipped, is the fruit of my tree. With the film approaching worldwide distribution, Burgess had become acutely aware of the power of the filmic medium. I fear, like any writer in my position, that the film may supersede the novel. If he had hopes that his genius would have been promoted and his auctorial authority preserved by such a faithful film, those hopes were now crumbling. More and more he realized that the book became known as the raw material for a film, and that he was regarded as a mere helper to Stanley Kubrick, a secondary creator who is feeding a primary creator. This, he admitted, I naturally resent. When in July Kubrick published the screenplay of his adaptation, a paperback volume that featured stills from the film juxtaposed with lines of dialogue often lifted from the novel, Burgess's bitterness escalated. He reviewed the book in persona as Alex, using Nadsat vocabulary and making fun of Kubrick, who wanted to have a book. And now he has a book he doth have, O my Malenki brothers, verily he doth, Kubrick o Zubrick the bookmaker. Not only Kubrick's film threatened to supersede the novel, now Kubrick even had his own Clockwork book. By the way, if you wonder why Kubrick is called Zubrick, it's just Burgess being Burgess. Zubrick is an Arab word for penis. Burgess also drastically revised his opinion on his novel. I detest that dumb book now, he blurted, and wished he could have it expunged from his literary record. An equally brusque opinion was reserved for Kubrick's film. Nothing to do with me, very beautiful but very dull and slow. Burgess would have much preferred to move on and focus on his other literary ventures, but a year later, in the spring of '73, a series of crimes brought A Clockwork Orange back to the public eye with a vengeance. When a teenager attacked and murdered a tramp, his defense attorney stated that the only possible explanation for the crime was that the violence was put into the boy's subconscious by the novel. Then a priest, there's always a priest all too keen to preach, isn't there? A priest wrote an open letter calling Burgess and Kubrick directly accountable. Few books or film to date can compare with the mindless brutality of A Clockwork Orange, a film he called a celluloid cesspool. The priest was utterly convinced that Burgess and Kubrick helped to fashion the blueprint of the crime. Man today will judge you guilty, he thundered, and so will God. Later that month, a second teenager attacked another boy, wearing white overalls, a bowler hat, and heavy boots. The judge accepted the view that the dastardly and wretched film was the instigator of the violent behavior, and called for the return as quickly as possible of some form of censorship. This incensed Burgess, who protested that these bloody judges were dictating what a writer could and could not write about. The worst thing about the controversy he revealed is that I have become known for one book. I would not mind if I liked the book, but A Clockwork Orange has all the faults which I rail against in fiction. It's didactic, it tends to pornography, it's tricky, it's gimmicky, it preaches too much. Burgess's irritation is understandable. He had to defend a book that in the 10 years since its publication had not generated any controversy, or any particular interest in fact. Only because of Kubrick's film, the novel had now become a kind of invisible primer of evil. Worse than that, Burgess himself was the target for official and public abuse related more directly to Kubrick's film than to his book. Yet Kubrick remained silent. He had defended his film in the American press when it opened, but he never took part in the political debate in England, nor he said anything about the so-called Clockwork killers. Even when he received death threats, his reaction was forceful but totally private. In consultation with the police, he secretly stopped any further distribution of the film in the country. Burgess felt he was left alone to defend both the book and the film. As he wrote in his autobiography, Kubrick filed the nails of his hand in Bournemouth and left me to be the target of vile accusation. Burgess now separated his book and Kubrick's film completely. My book was about the ultimate absurdity of violence, he said. Somehow the film doesn't convey that. He confessed he was drunk when he wrote the novel, it was the only way he could cope with the violence, and that he felt responsible. If you put an act of violence down on paper, you've created the act. You might as well have done it. Burgess was now of the opinion that Kubrick, on the contrary, had projected violence for its own sake, and that was damnable. Such an explicit and potentially harmful divorce didn't pass unnoticed. Warner Brothers issued a press release in which Burgess denied that he had changed opinion on the film, but he said, "I'm becoming increasingly exasperated by the assumption of guilt that it is my duty to defend the film against its attackers, and not merely my book. It is surely the duty of the maker of the film to speak out for his own work." Perhaps it is, but Kubrick again said nothing. In the following years, the presence of A Clockwork Orange in the media circuit dropped considerably, but not in the public's interest. The film had turned the novel into an international bestseller with millions of copies sold, and Burgess into a much sought-after celebrity. He started a non-stop world tour of lectures, piano concertos, courses on Joyce, Shakespeare, pornography. And he became a regular TV talk show guest and also a commodity for the cinema industry, commissioned to write film scripts. Finally, under the coveted spotlight for good, Burgess had to confront the fact that his fame was brought by A Poisonous Fruit, a flawed novel that yet had, as he said, a mythical impact of some kind thanks to a film that was accused of inciting violence. Cautiously, he tried to return to his position and said that the film, although very good per se, in terms of adaptation had many faults. It misses many of the main points of the book. And he still felt that Kubrick made violence very attractive. The main area of contention was the ending. Burgess had devised the book in 3 parts of 7 chapters each, totaling at 21, the symbol of human maturity. The narrative arc had to end with Alex's growth as a well-integrated citizen who put violence aside as a childish toy. Without this ending, there is no moral transformation. Alex remains a clockwork figure who's just impelled towards evil by some deterministic force, and the book fails to become a novel, remaining merely a fable. Burgess disclosed that the final chapter had been excised at the request of his American editor, who considered it too soft. In too weak a position to dispute and in need of money, Burgess accepted. He also said that Kubrick only discovered the existence of the final chapter when it was too late, halfway through the shooting. Because most people became aware of the book via Kubrick's film, it's a truncated version they know, one that conveys basically a different message. Burgess's true intentions were misunderstood because of Kubrick's interpretation. This was of course very painful for Burgess, a writer who has always put a strong moral undercurrent in his works. The novel and the film are here at their furthest, and would remain so for the following years. However, it seems Burgess found some solace in taunting Kubrick. In an article, he had his anti-hero Alex call Kubrick the gloopy shooter put me in the cine, that is, the foolish joke who put him in the cinema, and again playfully distorted his name as Lubric or Pubic. As an attempt to regain control of his work, in 1987 Burgess wrote a theatre adaptation whose ending included a striking stage direction. A man bearded like Stanley Kubrick comes on, singing in the rain on a trumpet. He is kicked off the stage. With the film long outside distribution circuit, there was no need for Warners to call Burgess to order, but Kubrick admitted in an interview that he wished Burgess would stop being bitchy about it. But Burgess never stopped and even increased his resentment, to the point that in his autobiography he offered nothing less than a revisionist view of his entire relationship with Kubrick and his film, rendered as an annoyance from the beginning, which then evolved into a sickening, wounding experience. Now, approaching the end of this survey, I feel I have to object to Burgess's view and say that if the wounds didn't heal, it was perhaps his fault. Burgess appeared to be irritated whenever he was asked about A Clockwork Orange. He said it was a great bore and a damn nuisance being associated so much with it, that it rankled him damnably and that he was sick to death of it, and yet he spoke about the novel at great length, examining ad nauseam his motives, the book's ideology, his feelings about Kubrick's film, his frustration over the missing chapter, to the point that his reluctance appears artificial. He never gave a short answer or a simple no comment. Kubrick, who bore the brunt of much worse reactions and truly felt his family was in danger, went to the police, not to the media. Burgess claimed he wished he hadn't written the book, but his extensive replies belie him. In fact, I'd argue that Burgess nurtured the debate surrounding A Clockwork Orange and kept the controversy alive, relaunching it over and over again, almost in a vicious circle. Comparing his behavior with Kubrick's is striking. In Kubrick's interviews, there's no mention of the controversy in the years after 1972. His silence paid off. He was never questioned about the link between films and violence, and A Clockwork Orange was not even mentioned when the depiction of violence on the screen was discussed in connection with Full Metal Jacket. On the contrary, Burgess remained embroiled in the controversy. He even pushed his literary alter ego, the poet F.X. Enderby, towards the clockwork phenomenon by creating a third book in the Enderby canon in which the poet has to deal with the misinterpretation of one of his work by a film director. Despite having nothing to do with his infamous novel or Kubrick's film, Burgess titled this book The Clockwork Testament. I suspect Burgess loved to be in the position in which A Clockwork Orange put him. He got the chance to play his favorite character, the bulwark artist, the alerting moralist who fights against the fallacies of society and quarrels energetically against every opponent, be it a moralizing judge, a bigoted priest, or a filmmaker who misrepresented his work. One of the consequences was that Burgess, and not Kubrick, was asked for an opinion every time a crime was committed in connection with a film, as if he, and again not Kubrick, were a sort of authority on the influence of violent films. Burgess always replied with a firm rejection of any form of censorship. If you start by suppressing a film, a play, a book, you end up by abolishing art. Perhaps a part of Burgess's resentment towards Kubrick could be explained if we consider that he might have read Kubrick's veto over the distribution of the film in Britain as an act of self-censorship, because Burgess never believed that Kubrick received death threats. In his later years, Burgess seemed to be finally somehow at peace with his controversial novel. In 1919 he said that he felt clean about Clockwork Orange and that he remained convinced that it was a necessary book to write. Burgess died in November 1993. A few months earlier, in what is the last and most surprising twist in this tale, he revealed he had to abandon a conviction that was part of his blood and bone, that the arts were sacrosanct and could never be accused of exerting either a moral or an immoral influence. Not only he had changed his mind completely, now Burgess even reconciled with Kubrick's self-imposed censorship. With his ban on distribution, Kubrick has admitted to the world that art can be harmful. From the film of A Clockwork Orange, youth didn't learn aggression, Burgess wrote, but a style of aggression, a mode of dressing violence up in a new way. Burgess was now convinced that a work of art has a magisterial quality about it, a justifying elan which grants virtue to imitation. At the end of his life, he had to accept the thesis he had vehemently fought against for 20 years, that art is dangerous. As a novelist, he confessed, "I belong to the ranks of the menacing." Burgess had become his own bloody judge and was telling to himself he was no longer free to write what he wanted. I don't know whether we should dismiss this article as a kind of senile rant. After all, half the text is a tirade about trashy television programming. In any case, this was Burgess's last swing, but the surprises are not over. After his death, the papers he left behind offer numerous revelations. This short presentation only allows me to talk about the 21st chapter. Letters to and from his editors shows that Burgess was in fact unsure where to end the novel, and that the inclusion of his optional epilogue had been decided by his English publisher, and that he would have been pleased if it was dropped. Accordingly, the script that he wrote for an early cinematic adaptation ends without Alex's maturation, so does the 1972 English reprinting of the book. And it is also not true that Kubrick became aware of the extended edition only too late. Other letters reveal that Kubrick inquired about Burgess's opinion on the 21st chapter while he was still writing the screenplay. Perhaps the importance of this chapter increased as Burgess grew older. Perhaps restoring Alex's maturation was a way to solve the issue of juvenile violence. Perhaps he used the truncation as a way to further dissociate himself from the film, or just quarrel against somebody. Either way, if not even death could stop the controversies surrounding A Clockwork Orange, I doubt I can find a resolution to the reversals presented in this talk. What started as an exploration of Burgess's relationship with Kubrick and his film has turned into a journey inside Burgess's mind, while he struggled to understand his infamous novel and perhaps himself. I would like therefore to conclude with a very perceptive quote by his literary agent. As so often with Burgess, it is difficult to establish where the truth stands in relation to his fictions. For him, the distinction between life and fantasy was completely blurred. I think an awful lot of himself was self-invented. If you have that sort of fertile mind, maybe self-invention is the most satisfactory way of being. Studying Anthony Burgess felt a bit like falling into a rabbit hole. Many of the stories that I knew about A Clockwork Orange proved to be false. For example, it is not true that Burgess wrote his novel in less than a year because he was diagnosed with a brain tumor, nor that the book was a response to his distress when his wife was assaulted and raped. If you want to know the full extent of Burgess's self-inventions, an expanded version of this presentation has just been published in an edited collection. It's titled Anthony Burgess, Stanley Kubrick and A Clockwork Orange, and it's out now. As always, thank you very much for your kind attention. See you at the next episode of Cracking the Cube. Bye bye!